Anthropologists have found that marriages everywhere are governed by two mutually exclusive principles, the principle of exogamy and that of endogamy. The principle of exogamy maintains that marriage, or at least the choice of a marriage partner, must come from a group that is outside the specific tribe or similar social unit, for if not, the problems associated with inbreeding will arise. Its flip side, endogamy, maintains that marriage must take place within a specific tribe or similar social unit if it wishes to retain its identity. Somewhere between these two extremes, society must find its own balance and comfort zone. What is considered a group for purposes of either exogamy or endogamy varies considerably. Within the context of a legal system, in most Western countries, there is generally but one limitation. That is that the partner must not be a blood relative, and in some cases a relative through marriage. These restrictions are covered by the laws of incest. Beyond that, a person is free to marry whomever he or she desires. And therefore, in most stratified societies, while one must marry outside the nuclear family, one is free to marry anyone whom he or she desires. And in this case, the exogamous group is small and the endogamous group is very large. If though one belongs to a particular group within the broader society, then depending on the restrictions of that group, if one wishes to retain membership, limitations are then placed upon the individual in terms of whom he or she may marry. This was the case with many of the immigrants who were forced to relocate from Europe. The Greeks insisted that their children marry Greeks. The Italians similarly required an Italian partner for their children. In some cases it was a requirement, in others it was a preference. Expatriates from England would have preferred that their children marry someone from English extraction, French from French extraction, and so on and so forth. Within the Jewish communities throughout the world, the red line that defined who was in and who was out of the community was intermarriage. For better or for worse, this is no longer the case, but in the generation that came out of Europe, along with the second generation born in the newly adopted country of residence, having your child marry someone who was not Jewish was unforgivable. With acculturation came acceptance, and with acceptance has come a lessening for the need to retain one's earlier identity. This was the case with respect to the Jewish communities of Western Europe following the emancipation. From France and Germany, the process of acculturation, followed by assimilation, spread to Austria and Hungary, eventually reaching Poland and parts of Russia. This was the case in the early 1900s with respect to the Jews who emigrated from the Ukraine, that within 4 generations they had jettisoned their Jewishness and certainly their Judaism. And in my own country of birth, as much as one may not like the idea of crossing the red line of intermarriage, for all intents and purposes, most families have made their accommodations to this fact of life. The topic of Jewish identity is one that has been debated time and time again as the Jewish community responds to the host nation in which they live. Nowadays, the term Jewish covers an extremely broad range of individuals who maintain a connection to the theoretical Am Yisrael. From my observations, though, there are 2 broad strands, very often overlapping, that define the term Jewish. One strand is an ethnic identity, and at the risk of oversimplification, I would suggest is really an expression of Jewishness, where one incorporates activities that express that ethnic identity. Activities ranging from sending children to a Jewish school, the food eaten on specific occasions such as Shabbat and the Chagim, the concept of family, Holocaust, Jewish sports, language, and by far the strongest force is the commitment to Israel. In this context, being Jewish expresses a feeling of belonging to a subgroup within the host country. Jewishness also borrows from Judaism as a religion, but Judaism certainly is not the central pillar for one's Jewishness. A second broad expression of the term Jewish is a religious identity in which Judaism is the central force and the motivating factor for expressions of Jewishness. To the non-practicing Jew, Jewish DNA is the defining factor in maintaining continuity, and hence measuring continuity is usually linked to the rates of intermarriage. Exogamy choosing a marriage partner outside a specific tribe. The red line would be, up until relatively recent time, marrying somebody who was not born Jewish. And conversely, somebody who was born Jewish but had very little commitment to the religion was never a problem. To the 10 to 20% of the theoretical Am Yisrael, Judaism informed their identity, and in addition to being born Jewish or through conversion, there is also a need to have a commitment to halachic Judaism. The broad term used to describe this commitment is Orthodox, a term coined in the days of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch during the 1800s, who writes that Orthodox Judaism does not know of any varieties of Judaism. He conceives Judaism as indivisible. He took issue with the Reform movement that hyphenated Judaism as Mosaic, prophetic, rabbinic, nor for that matter, Orthodox or liberal Judaism. Judaism is a religion, and there is either Judaism or non-Judaism. In today's day and age, the identity would be either a socio-ethnic identity, Jewishness, or a religious identity, the commitment to halachic Judaism. As with all socio-ethnic groups, as the group expands, it passes through a stage of fragmentation, and with the resurgence of Orthodox Judaism, especially in America, subgroups developed that asserted their own identity through social groupings, clothing, etc. Nowadays we have four main subgroups, all four within the Orthodox camp. You have the Hasidic, the Litvish, the Sephardi, and the Frum centrists, committed to Orthodox Judaism as a religion and also to Zionism and the State of Israel. And as each of these groups expanded, they went through another metamorphosis. As for example, within the Hasidic camp, there are a number of major strands, such as the Chabad, Satmar, Ger, Belz, and Bobov brands of Hasidic Judaism. Ultimately, each group moves the red line with respect to defining their definitions of the social unit. As each subgroup expands, there's pressure upon the next generation to maintain the customs that identify that subgroup from the others, and therefore in the case of the Hasidic world, Chabad parents would prefer to draw marriage partners for their children from within the Chabad movement, similarly with the Satmar, Ger, and so forth. This, of course, is not based on the halachic definition of who is a Jew, but is a natural outgrowth of a desire to maintain one's peculiar brand of Judaism. The term that is bandied around is the word yichus, which we shall now explore.